The encounter. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the quiet streets in hues of gold and orange as Officer Mark Thompson patrolled the suburbs in his cruiser. A seasoned officer in his mid-40s, Mark had a reputation for being calm under pressure and dedicated to his community. Today seemed no different, just another routine shift on a lazy weekday. He cruised past rows of suburban houses, their manicured lawns glowing in the evening light. Kids rode bikes along the sidewalk, their laughter a welcome contrast to the usual calls he dealt with. Mark eased the cruiser into the parking lot of a small park for a quick break, the scent of fresh-cut grass wafting through his open window. He had just lifted his coffee to take a sip when a slight movement caught his eye. A young girl, no older than 10 or 11, stepped hesitantly onto the pavement. Her dark skin seemed to gleam against the fading sunlight, her slender frame wrapped in a tattered hoodie several sizes too big. She clutched the straps of her faded backpack tightly, her eyes darting around nervously as though unsure if she should approach. Mark frowned and set his coffee aside. She walked toward the cruiser, her sneakers scuffing softly against the asphalt. When she reached the window, she hesitated, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Mark lowered the window, his expression softening. "Hi there," he greeted, his tone warm but measured. "Everything okay?" For a moment, she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the ground. Then, as if summoning courage from some deep well within, she leaned forward and whispered two words so softly Mark barely caught them. "Help me." Her voice was shaky, almost inaudible, but the raw fear behind it was unmistakable. Mark's instincts flared to life. He straightened in his seat, his senses sharpening. "Are you hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice low and calm. The girl shook her head quickly but stayed silent. Mark noticed how tightly she clutched her backpack, her knuckles white against the fraying straps. "Okay," he said gently, stepping out of the car. "Let's sit down and talk for a minute. You're safe now." The girl hesitated but followed him to a nearby bench. Mark sat down first, giving her space. She perched on the edge of the bench, still clutching her bag, her posture rigid. Up close, Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes, dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and something deeper, something darker. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone soft. "Zara," she whispered, barely audible. "That's a pretty name, Zara," Mark said with a small smile. "I'm Officer Mark. You're not in trouble, okay? I just want to make sure you're all right. Can you tell me what's going on?" For a long moment, Zara didn't respond. She stared at her shoes, the silence stretching between them. Just as Mark was about to speak again, she finally answered, her voice trembling. There's a bad man," she said. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. He's watching me." Mark's heart clenched. "Where is he now? Is he close by?" Zara shook her head. "He's not here, but he knows where I live." Mark leaned forward slightly, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Okay. Can you tell me more about him? Does he live near you? Is he a stranger?" Zara hesitated, then nodded. He's someone my mom knows," she said. "But he's bad. He hurts people." Mark's mind raced as he pieced together her fragmented sentences. He reached for his radio but stopped, not wanting to alarm her. "Zara, you did the right thing by coming to me. We're going to figure this out, okay? But first, I need to know, are you hurt? Did this man do anything to you?" Her eyes welled up again, and she shook her head. "Not me, but my mom." Mark's stomach dropped. "Your mom," he repeated, his voice steady despite the surge of urgency he felt. "Is she okay?" Zara shook her head again, this time more violently. "I don't know. I haven't seen her since yesterday. He came to the house, and there was yelling. Then he left, and she didn't come out of her room." Mark felt a chill creep down his spine. He couldn't ignore the weight of her words. "Where is your house, Zara? Is it nearby? She hesitated, then nodded. It's close. I ran here because I didn't know what else to do. Mark nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. All right, Zora. I'm going to help you, but I need you to do something for me. Can you stay right here for just a minute? I'm going to call for some backup so we can check on your mom. Panic flashed across her face. No, you can't let him know I told you. He'll hurt her, or me. Mark placed a reassuring hand on the bench beside her, careful not to invade her space. Zara, I promise I'll keep you safe. And your mom too. But I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Can you trust me? She bit her lip, her small hands gripping her backpack tighter. After a long moment, she nodded. Mark stood, stepping a few paces away to call for backup. As he spoke into the radio, he kept one eye on Zora, his protective instincts in overdrive. He didn't know who this bad man was or what exactly Zara had witnessed, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be a simple call. As he returned to the bench, Zara looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with a flicker of hope. For the first time, Mark felt the weight of her words truly sink in. Whatever was happening in her life, it was far worse than he could have imagined, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The whispered clue. The police cruiser's engine hummed steadily as it cruised through the quiet streets, Zara in the backseat, her tiny frame dwarfed by the large seatbelt that strapped her in. Officer Mark Thompson drove with a steady hand, his partner, Officer Rachel Perez, sitting in the passenger seat beside him. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the city in the cool glow of twilight. Rachel glanced at Zora through the rearview mirror. You okay back there, kiddo? She asked, her voice soft, careful not to spook her. Zora gave a small nod, but her hands fidgeted with the straps of her worn backpack. Her silence spoke volumes, and Mark knew they were only scratching the surface of whatever danger she had run from. He glanced at Rachel and gave her a slight nod, signaling her to let Zara settle at her own pace. As they turned onto a side street, Mark spoke, keeping his tone light but purposeful. Zara, we're heading to your house now, okay? But before we get there, can you tell us anything else about this man? Anything that will help us keep you and your mom safe? For a moment, Zara didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the passing houses, their windows glowing softly in the dusk. Then, as if deciding something, she leaned forward slightly. His name is Malcolm, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said he was my mom's friend, but he's not. He scares her. Mark exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, who immediately started typing the name into the patrol car's onboard computer. Do you know Malcolm's last name? Rachel asked gently. Zara shook her head. I just heard my mom say it once. Something like, Lewis, maybe. Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up records. A moment later, she looked up, her expression grim. We might have something. Malcolm Lewis, mid-40s, multiple prior arrests for domestic violence, aggravated assault, and she hesitated, glancing at Zora before continuing in a lower voice. Drug-related charges. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenching. That's enough to know we're not walking into this unprepared. Let's make sure Zora stays safe while we figure out what's going on. Zora looked up, her eyes wide. You're not going to let him hurt her, right? You promise? Mark glanced at her through the mirror, his voice firm. I promise, Zora. We'll do everything we can to protect you and your mom. They turned onto the streets Zora had directed them to, the neighborhood transitioning from suburban charm to a rougher, more worn-down feel. Cracked sidewalks and dimly lit streetlights painted a picture of neglect. Zora pointed to a small, weather-beaten house near the end of the block. That's it, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark pulled the cruiser to a stop a few houses away, the engine idling. He turned to Rachel. Stay with her. I'll check it out. Zora's eyes widened. No, you can't go alone. Malcolm's. He's mean. He could. Mark knelt beside her, his expression softening. Zara, I've been doing this a long time. I know how to handle mean people, but I need you to stay here with Officer Perez, okay? She'll keep you safe. Zara hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Rachel shifted in her seat, ready to reassure the girl. Mark stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting near his holster as he approached the house. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified. The distant bark of a dog, the creak of a loose board under his boot. The front yard was littered with discarded items, old lawn chairs, broken toys, and a rusting barbecue grill. Mark climbed the steps to the porch, his eyes scanning the area. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. He knocked firmly on the door. Police. Is anyone home? He called, his voice steady. There was no response. Mark knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. His gut told him something was off. He glanced back at the cruiser, where Rachel gave him a subtle nod, ready to act if needed. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Mark, be careful, Rachel's voice crackled over his radio. He pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp in the living room. The air smelled stale, with an undercurrent of something metallic that made Mark's stomach tighten. He stepped inside, his hand hovering over his radio. Police, if anyone's here, make yourself known, he called out again. A faint sound came from the back of the house. A shuffle, like something being dragged. Mark moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the worn linoleum. He passed a small kitchen, the counters cluttered with unwashed dishes and empty bottles. The sound came again, louder this time. Mark reached a narrow hallway, the walls lined with faded family photos. One picture caught his eye, a younger Zara, smiling brightly, standing beside a woman who must have been her mother. The woman's expression was weary but kind, her arm draped protectively around her daughter. The sound came again, now unmistakably from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. Mark's pulse quickened as he approached, his hand resting on the grip of his firearm. He reached the door and paused, listening intently. The sound had stopped. He knocked lightly. This is Officer Thompson. Is anyone in there? There was no response, but the silence was deafening. Mark tested the handle. It was locked. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him that time was running out. Rachel, he said into his radio, keeping his voice low. I got a locked door and suspicious sounds inside. I'm going in. Copy that. Backup is en route, Rachel replied. Mark stepped back and kicked the door in with practiced force. It flew open, revealing a small bedroom. The scene before him made his breath catch. A woman, bound and gagged, lay on the floor, her face bruised and swollen. Her eyes widened with fear as she looked up at Mark. Beside her was an overturned chair and a cell phone, its screen cracked. Blood smears marked the floor near her wrists where she had struggled against her bindings. Ma'am, it's okay, Mark said quickly, moving to her side. He pulled out his pocket knife and cut through the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. You're safe now. Tears streamed down her face as she gasped. He's coming back. Malcolm, he said he'd come back. Mark's mind raced. He grabbed his radio. Rachel, I need EMTs at this location now. Victim found, possible injuries. Suspect may return. Copy that, Rachel's voice came back. We've got units inbound. As Mark helped the woman sit up, she clutched his arm desperately. Please, protect Zara. Don't let him take her. Mark's heart tightened. She's safe, ma'am. She's with my partner in the car. We'll make sure nothing happens to her. Just then, the unmistakable sound of a car engine roared outside. Mark's head snapped up. Through the window, he saw a dark sedan pulling up to the curb. A figure stepped out. A man, tall and broad, his movements purposeful and menacing. Mark's jaw clenched, Malcolm had just arrived. Mark positioned himself beside the window, his eyes tracking Malcolm as he strode toward the house. The man's silhouette was imposing against the dim streetlights. He walked with a predatory confidence, his shoulders squared, and his hands stuffed into the pockets of a heavy coat. Even at a glance, Mark could tell this wasn't a man accustomed to being challenged. Mark turned back to the woman, who was struggling to sit upright, her face pale and panic-stricken. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Lock this door after I leave. Help is on the way." She nodded weakly, her trembling hands clutching at the ropes that had bound her moments before. Mark stepped into the hallway, his movements deliberate and quiet. He needed to get back to Zara and Rachel before Malcolm reached the cruiser. The last thing he wanted was for Zara to face this man again. He clicked his radio. "Rachel, Malcolm's here. Dark sedan just pulled up outside. Stay with Zara and be ready to move." Rachel's voice came back immediately, calm but firm. "Understood. We're locked in the cruiser, and I'm keeping an eye on him. Backup's 5 minutes out." Mark made his way to the front door, his mind racing. If Malcolm reached the cruiser before backup arrived, it could escalate quickly. He didn't know if the man was armed, but his history suggested a volatile temperament. Mark couldn't take any chances. As he stepped out onto the porch, Malcolm was already at the bottom of the stairs. His sharp eyes locked onto Mark, and he froze mid-step. The two men regarded each other for a tense moment, the cool night air thick with unspoken threats. "You're not supposed to be here," Malcolm said finally, his voice low and menacing. He shifted his weight, his hands still in his coat pockets. Mark kept his stance relaxed but ready, his hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. "Evening," he said evenly. "I'm Officer Thompson. We received a call about a disturbance at this address." Malcolm's lips curled into a sneer. "Disturbance? There's no disturbance here. This is my house. You got no business here." Mark tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Your house, huh? Funny, because the young girl I spoke to earlier mentioned a man by your description who doesn't live here, but seems to cause a lot of trouble. Care to explain?" Malcolm's face darkened, and his posture stiffened. "That kid doesn't know what she's talking about. You're trespassing. Officer, you need to leave." Mark stepped down a single step, closing the distance between them slightly. His voice remained calm but firm. "Not until I've ensured everyone inside is safe. Now, why don't you tell me where you've been this evening?" Malcolm chuckled darkly, a sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "You think you scare me? I know my rights. You've got no warrant, and you sure as hell don't have cause to be here." Mark didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like Malcolm before, bullies who relied on intimidation to get their way. "You're right," he said. "I don't have a warrant. What I do have is probable cause and a responsibility to protect the people in this community. And right now, you're the one under suspicion." Malcolm took another step forward, his hand twitching toward his coat pocket. Mark's hand moved instinctively to his firearm, his voice dropping into a warning tone. "Don't do it." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Malcolm's hand hovered, and Mark could see the tension in his jaw, the calculation in his eyes. Then, slowly, Malcolm raised both hands in mock surrender, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "Relax, officer," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I was just grabbing my cigarettes." Mark's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He kept his stance firm, his eyes locked on Malcolm. "Turn around and place your hands on your head," he ordered. "Now." Malcolm hesitated, his smile faltering as he weighed his options. Just then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Malcolm's eyes darted toward the sound, and Mark could see the realization dawn on him. His time was running out. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice defiant. "You can't prove anything." Mark took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "That's not your decision to make. Turn around. Hands on your head." For a moment, it seemed Malcolm might comply. Then, in a flash, he bolted toward his car. Mark sprang into action, shouting, "Stop! Police!" as he gave chase. Malcolm reached the car and yanked the door open, but Mark was on him before he could climb inside. With a swift, practiced motion, Mark grabbed Malcolm's arm and pulled him back, slamming the door shut with his other hand. The two men struggled briefly, but Mark's training and experience gave him the upper hand. With a final shove, Mark pinned Malcolm against the car, twisting his arm behind his back. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Mark secured the cuffs around Malcolm's wrists, backup arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the scene. Rachel exited the cruiser, keeping Zara close to her side as she approached. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning Mark for any signs of injury. Mark nodded, his grip on Malcolm firm. "Yeah, he's not going anywhere." Zara peeked out from behind Rachel, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. Mark met her gaze and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "It's over, Zara," he said. "You're safe now." For the first time, Zara's tense shoulders relaxed and a small, hesitant smile appeared on her face. Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for her or her mother, but for now, they were safe, and that was enough to keep him going. The truth unveiled. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the street in an eerie glow as the backup officers processed Malcolm's arrest. The neighborhood had fallen silent, residents peeking out through their curtains, too afraid or too curious to step outside. Mark leaned against his cruiser, catching his breath. Malcolm sat in the back of another patrol car, his head bowed, his expression a mixture of rage and defeat. Zara stood a few feet away, clutching Rachel's hand like a lifeline. Her small frame looked even smaller under the glow of the streetlights, and Mark could see the toll the night had taken on her. But there was something else in her eyes now. Hope. Mark knelt down beside her, keeping his voice soft. "You did something really brave tonight, Zara. You helped us stop a dangerous man." Zara's lower lip trembled. "But is my mom okay? Did he hurt her?" Mark nodded gently. "Your mom's safe. She's shaken up, but we're going to make sure she gets the help she needs. And you too." Tears welled up in Zara's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. I didn't know what else to do. He said if I told anyone, he'd." Mark placed a reassuring hand on the bench beside her, careful not to crowd her. "He's not going to hurt anyone anymore. You're safe now, Zara. You and your mom." Rachel crouched down beside them. "You were smart to come to us," she added. "Not everyone has the courage to stand up to someone like Malcolm. You did the right thing." Zara nodded slowly, her grip on Rachel's hand loosening slightly. Mark exchanged a glance with Rachel before turning back to the girl. "Zara," he began, "we're going to take you to the station, and we'll make sure you and your mom have a safe place to stay tonight. But I need your help to understand what's been going on. Can you tell me more about Malcolm? Anything you remember could be important." Zara hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. After a long pause, she finally spoke. He came to our house a few weeks ago. At first, Mom said he was just a friend, but then he started yelling at her. He'd get mad all the time." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "Sometimes, he'd bring other people to the house. They'd go into the basement and lock the door. Mom told me to stay upstairs, but I heard them talking. They said things about money and product. I didn't know what they meant." Mark's jaw tightened. It was starting to make sense now. Malcolm wasn't just a violent man. He was likely running some kind of operation out of Zara's home. Drugs, maybe even trafficking. Whatever it was, it explained his desperation to keep the police away. "What about tonight?" Rachel asked gently. "What happened that made you come find us?" Zara's eyes filled with tears again, and her voice dropped to a whisper. He told my mom she owed him money. A lot of money. She said she didn't have it, and he got so mad. He pushed her, and she fell. I ran out of the house. I was scared he'd hurt her more. Mark felt a surge of anger, but he kept his expression calm for Zora's sake. He nodded, his voice steady. You were right to get help. And because of you, we're going to make sure he never hurts anyone again. Rachel stood and placed a comforting hand on Zora's shoulder. Why don't we take you to see your mom now? I think she'll feel a lot better once she knows you're okay. Zora's face lit up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Can I? I just want to make sure she's not, you know. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. She's waiting for you at the station. Let's go. The ride to the station was quiet. Zora sat in the back seat, her head leaning against the window, her eyes half closed. Mark and Rachel exchanged a few words, coordinating with the officers at the station to ensure Zora and her mother would be placed in protective custody for the night. When they arrived, the station was buzzing with activity. Malcolm had been taken to an interrogation room, his protests silenced by the evidence mounting against him. Zora clung to Rachel's side as they made their way through the building, her eyes darting nervously at the uniformed officers bustling around them. In a small private room, Zora's mother sat on a padded bench, her face pale but composed. Her wrists bore faint bruises from the ropes, and her eyes were red from crying, but she stood the moment Zora entered. Zora, she cried, rushing forward to pull her daughter into a tight hug. Tears streamed down her face as she held the girl close, whispering, I was so worried about you. I thought. I'm okay, Mom, Zora said, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. Officer Mark and Rachel. They helped me. Mark and Rachel stood by the door, giving the two a moment. When Zora's mother looked up, her expression was one of profound gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking. Thank you for bringing her back to me. Mark nodded, his tone gentle but firm. We're glad she found us, but we need to talk about what's been happening. Malcolm is in custody now, but we need to know everything you can tell us about him. Zora's mother hesitated, glancing down at her daughter. Can she wait outside? I don't want her to hear. Of course, Rachel said quickly. Come on, Zora. Let's grab a snack while your mom talks to Officer Mark. Zora looked up at her mother, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Rachel guided her out of the room, leaving Mark and Zora's mother alone. Once the door closed, Mark pulled up a chair and sat across from her. You're safe now, he began, but if we're going to keep it that way, I need you to be honest with me. What was Malcolm doing in your home? Zora's mother took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. It started with a loan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was struggling to pay rent, and a friend told me Malcolm could help. He gave me the money, but the interest, it just kept growing. When I couldn't pay, he started coming around more often. He'd yell, threaten me. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she continued. Then he started bringing people to the house. He said I could work off what I owed by letting him use the basement. I didn't know what they were doing at first, but then I saw the drugs, the weapons. I didn't know how to stop it. Mark's jaw tightened. Why didn't you call the police? I was scared, she admitted. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt Zora, or worse. I couldn't take that risk. Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. You did what you thought you had to do to protect her. But now, we're here to help. Malcolm's not going to hurt you or Zora ever again. And with your testimony, we can make sure he goes away for a long time. Zora's mother nodded, her expression resolute. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want my daughter to be safe. Mark stood, offering her a reassuring smile. She's safe now. You both are. Let's make sure it stays that way. As he left the room, Mark felt a sense of determination settle over him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Zora and her mother had taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives, and he would do everything in his power to ensure they succeeded. Malcolm's web of deceit. The next morning, the police station was abuzz with activity. The events of the previous night had set off a chain reaction of investigations, and Malcolm Lewis was at the center of it all. Officer Mark Thompson sat in the conference room, flipping through the file that Rachel had compiled. It was thicker than he had expected, filled with reports of assaults, suspected drug activity, and even whispers of human trafficking. Mark sighed and leaned back in his chair. This guy's been on the radar for years, but no one's been able to pin anything solid on him. Rachel entered the room, a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. "Well, now we got him," she said, setting the cup on the table. "Between Zora's statement, her mom's testimony, and the evidence we found in the house, it's a pretty airtight case." Mark nodded, but his brow furrowed. "It's not just about him, though. You don't run an operation like his alone. If we take him down, there's a good chance his associates are going to scatter, and they might try to tie up loose ends." Rachel's face darkened. "You mean Zara and her mom?" "Exactly," Mark said. "If Malcolm was running drugs or trafficking people, whoever he was working with won't take kindly to this kind of attention. We need to move fast and make sure we keep them safe." In the interrogation room, Malcolm sat slouched in his chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. His demeanor was defiant, a smirk playing on his lips as he stared at the one-way mirror. Mark watched him for a moment before stepping inside, his expression calm but unreadable. "Morning, Malcolm," Mark said, taking the seat across from him. "Hope you slept well." Malcolm chuckled darkly. "I've slept in worse places, officer. You'll have to do better than this." Mark leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Oh, I think we've done plenty. You see, we've got enough evidence to put you away for a long time. Drugs, weapons, assault, it's quite the list." Malcolm shrugged, his smirk widening. "You don't have anything that'll stick. Trust me, I've been here before." Mark's expression didn't waver. "You're right. You've managed to wiggle out of trouble before. But this time, we have witnesses. Zara and her mother have given us everything we need to build a solid case against you." At the mention of Zora's name, Malcolm's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened. "You think I care what they say? You think anyone's going to believe some scared little girl and her junkie mom?" Mark's fist clenched under the table, but he kept his tone measured. "You underestimate them. Zara was brave enough to come to us, and her mom's finally ready to fight back. You're out of moves, Malcolm." For a moment, Malcolm said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe I'm out of moves. But you should know, officer, I'm not the only one you're dealing with. You think putting me in here is going to solve your problems. You're wrong." Mark's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why don't you enlighten me?" Malcolm chuckled again, the sound low and menacing. "You're poking a hornet's nest, and when the others find out you've got me here, they won't be happy. They don't like loose ends, and they sure as hell don't like cops meddling in their business." Mark leaned closer, his eyes locked on Malcolm's. "Who are the others?" "Let's check it out," Mark said, motioning for two officers to accompany them. He turned to the remaining officer. "Stay here and keep eyes on the house. If anything happens, call it in immediately." The team approached the sit-in cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft gravel of the roadside. Mark signaled for Rachel to take the right side while he moved to the driver's side. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior. The car was empty. "Clear," Rachel said, scanning the passenger side. Mark nodded, but something about the scene felt off. The car's windows were slightly fogged, as if someone had been sitting inside not long ago. The engine was cold to the touch, but faint footprints in the dirt near the driver's side door suggested recent activity. Mark crouched down, examining the prints. They led away from the car and into the tree line that bordered the safe house property. He stood, his senses on high alert. "They were here," he said quietly. "And they're not far." Back at the safe house, Zara and her mother were sitting in the small living room, their faces etched with worry. The tension in the air was palpable, and Zara clutched her backpack like a lifeline. The officers inside the house maintained a watchful presence, their radios crackling softly with updates. Rachel entered first, her demeanor calm but focused. She crouched down beside Zara, her voice gentle. "Hey, kiddo. Everything's okay, but we might need to stay extra quiet tonight, all right? Just a precaution." Zara nodded, her eyes wide. Her mother looked up at Rachel, her voice trembling. "Is it him? Is it Malcolm's people?" Rachel hesitated, glancing at Mark as he entered the room. Mark stepped forward, his tone steady. "We're not sure yet, but we're taking every precaution. You're safe here. We're making sure of that." Zara's mother nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Mark turned to one of the officers stationed at the front door. "I want a full perimeter sweep. Make sure no one's on the property, and get another unit out here for backup." As the officer moved to comply, Mark pulled Rachel aside. "Whoever left that car was scouting. They might be testing our defenses, seeing how we respond." Rachel frowned. "You think they'll come back?" Mark nodded grimly. "If they're part of Malcolm's operation, they will. And they won't come back alone." Hours passed with no sign of movement outside. The safe house remained quiet, though the tension among the officers grew with each passing minute. Mark sat in the small kitchen, his eyes scanning a map of the surrounding area. The wooded terrain around the house offered plenty of cover, making it a prime location for anyone trying to approach unnoticed. Rachel entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Mark and leaned against the counter. "Still nothing," she said, her voice low. "You think they're waiting for us to let our guard down?" "Maybe," Mark replied, taking a sip. "Or they're regrouping. Either way, we stay vigilant." Before Rachel could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Both officers froze, their hands instinctively moving to their sidearms. Mark signaled for Rachel to cover him as he approached the front door. "Police," he called out. "Identify yourself." No response. Mark opened the door cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the empty porch. He stepped outside, scanning the area. The cool night air was still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. And then he saw it. A small black box sat on the porch, a plain envelope taped to the top. Mark's heart sank as he recognized the intent behind the delivery. "Rachel," he said, his voice tense, "get everyone away from the windows. Now." Rachel didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly back into the house, ushering Zara and her mother into the farthest room, and positioning officers to cover every angle. Mark crouched beside the box, examining it closely. The envelope bore no markings except for a single word scrawled in bold black letters. "Stop." Mark's mind raced. The box could be a threat, a bomb, a trap, or simply a psychological message designed to rattle them. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Officer Thompson. We have a suspicious package at the safe house, requesting immediate bomb squad assistance." While they waited for the bomb squad, Mark re-entered the house, his expression grave. Zara's mother stood as he entered, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated, then spoke firmly. "A message. Someone wants us to back off." Zara's mother's hands flew to her mouth. "They know we're here." "They know we're watching," Mark corrected. "And they're trying to scare us. But it's not going to work." Rachel rejoined them, her tone brisk. "The team's on its way. ETA 20 minutes. Malcolm smirked again, but didn't answer. Mark resisted the urge to slam his fists on the table. He knew Malcolm wanted to play games, but he didn't have time for that. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enjoy your time here, Malcolm," Mark said, his voice cold. "It's going to be a long stay." As he left the room, he found Rachel waiting for him in the hallway. "He give you anything?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Not directly. But he made it clear there's more going on here than we thought. He's part of a bigger operation." Rachel frowned. Great. That means whoever he's working with could be watching us right now. Exactly, Mark said. We need to step up protection for Zara and her mom. And we need to figure out who Malcolm's working with before they make their next move. Later that day, Mark and Rachel drove Zora and her mother to a secure, safe house on the outskirts of the city. It was a small, nondescript house surrounded by trees, with a private driveway that made it easy to monitor any approaching vehicles. 2 other officers were already stationed there, ready to provide round-the-clock protection. As they pulled into the driveway, Zara leaned forward in her seat. "Are we going to be safe here?" she asked, her voice small. Mark turned to her, his tone reassuring. "Yes, this is one of the safest places we have. And there will always be officers here to make sure no one can hurt you." Zara nodded, but her grip on her backpack didn't loosen. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a small, tired smile. Inside the house, Mark and Rachel went over the security measures with the officers on duty. Zara and her mom settled into one of the bedrooms, the tension in their faces easing slightly as they realized they were truly safe. For now. As Mark prepared to leave, Zara ran up to him, her eyes wide. "Will you come back?" she asked. "If something happens." Mark knelt down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Zora. I promise." Zara nodded, her small face set with determination. "Okay, I trust you." Back at the station, Mark and Rachel began piecing together the evidence they had gathered. They reviewed Malcolm's known associates, cross-referencing their names with recent activity in the area. It didn't take long to find a connection. A man named Victor Delgado, a mid-level drug trafficker with a reputation for violence. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. Delgado's been tied to a lot of shady deals, but no one's been able to nail him. If Malcolm's working with him, this could get messy. Mark nodded grimly. "We need to find Delgado before he finds us." Just as they were formulating their plan, Mark's phone buzzed. It was one of the officers stationed at the safe house. "Thompson," he answered, his voice brisk. "Sir," the officer said, his tone tense. "We've got a problem. There's been a car parked down the road for the past hour. No one's gotten out, but it's definitely not from the neighborhood." Mark's heart sank. "Stay on high alert. We're on our way." As he hung up, he turned to Rachel. "It's starting. Let's move." Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he and Rachel sped toward the safe house. The car's lights cut through the dark streets, the urgency of their mission reflected in the tense silence between them. The officer's call replayed in Mark's mind. A suspicious car parked near the safe house was more than a coincidence. Whoever was watching wasn't just curious. They were likely connected to Malcolm's operation. Rachel broke the silence. "Do you think they're just watching, or are they planning something?" Mark didn't take his eyes off the road. "Could be either. But we're not taking any chances. If they're bold enough to stake out a police-protected safe house, they're sending a message." Rachel nodded, checking her sidearm out of habit. "We'll send one back." As they approached the safe house, Mark turned off the headlights, guiding the car into the long driveway with care. The area was quiet, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. A second police vehicle was parked near the entrance, its presence a reminder of the heightened security measures. The officers on duty stepped out to greet them. "Situation?" Mark asked briskly as he exited the vehicle. The younger officer, a woman with a sharp gaze, pointed toward the road. Black sedan parked about 50 yards down. It's been there for over an hour. No lights, no movement. Mark followed her gaze. The car was barely visible in the distance, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. He exchanged a glance with Rachel, who gave a slight nod. Mark nodded, his focus shifting to Zora. She sat quietly in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and trust. Mark crouched beside her, his voice soft. "Zara, I need you to listen to me. You're safe here, okay? No matter what happens, We won't let anyone hurt you." She nodded slowly, her small voice barely audible. "I believe you." Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Good, because we're not giving up." The threat unveiled. The rumble of engines broke the silence as the bomb squad's van pulled into the driveway of the safe house. The scene outside was tense, with officers stationed around the perimeter, their weapons ready. Inside, Mark and Rachel stood with Zara and her mother, offering quiet reassurances as they waited for news. Zara clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes darting toward the front door every time someone moved. Her mother tried to smile down at her, but the fear etched into her face betrayed her emotions. Mark, standing near the window, kept a watchful eye on the team outside. He had seen intimidation tactics like this before, but the deliberate placement of the package made it clear this wasn't a bluff. The lead technician from the bomb squad, a tall, wiry man named Harris, approached the front door in his protective suit. He gave Mark a curt nod through the glass before kneeling beside the package. Mark's radio crackled to life moments later. "Thompson, this is Harris. Package appears stable. No obvious signs of explosives, but we're proceeding with caution." "Understood," Mark replied. "Keep us updated." As Harris and his team worked, Rachel stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What do you think is in it?" she asked quietly. Mark shook his head. "Could be anything. Drugs, a tracking device, or even just a scare tactic. Whatever it is, it's a message." Rachel frowned. "If this is their opening move, they're not just warning us. They're daring us to push further." Mark nodded grimly. "And we will." Minutes felt like hours as the bomb squad carefully opened the package. Inside, they found a smaller metal box. Harris relayed the discovery to Mark. "We're opening the inner container now," Harris said over the radio. "No sign of explosive material so far." "Proceed carefully," Mark replied, tension tightening his voice. The team's movements were meticulous as they pried open the box. Inside were several items: a smartphone, a flash drive, and a photograph. Harris radioed the findings to Mark and brought the items inside under secure conditions. The photograph was handed to Mark first. It was a grainy image of Zara and her mother, taken from a distance, likely while they were still at their home. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "You can't protect them forever." Mark's stomach dropped. He handed the photo to Rachel, who swore under her breath. "They'd been watching for a while," she said, her voice taut with anger. Mark turned his attention to the flash drive. "Let's see what else they left us." Inside the safe house, the officers set up a secure laptop to examine the contents of the drive. Rachel connected it while Mark stood behind her, his arms crossed. Zara and her mother sat on the couch nearby, watching silently, their fear palpable. The screen flickered as the drive's contents loaded. A single video file. Rachel glanced at Mark, who nodded for her to play it. The video began with a static-filled image of a dark room. A man's voice, low and distorted, spoke over the hum of background noise. "You've crossed a line, Officer Thompson. Malcolm was an asset, and now he's your liability." The camera panned to show a hooded figure sitting at a table, their face obscured. "We know where you are. We know who you're protecting. And if you don't release Malcolm, things will get messy." The video cut off abruptly, leaving the room in heavy silence. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her jaw clenched. "They're threatening a cop. That's bold." "It's not just me," Mark said, his voice low. "They're threatening Zara and her mom. This isn't about Malcolm anymore. It's about shutting down anyone who stands in their way." Mark turned to the smartphone found in the box. It was locked, but Rachel quickly bypassed the password using software on the laptop. The phone's message inbox revealed a series of texts between Malcolm and an unknown contact. "Unknown. The cops are closing in. Move the product." "Malcolm. I need time. Can't move it until Thursday." "Unknown. No time. Handle it, or we'll handle you." The texts painted a picture of a strained relationship between Malcolm and his associates. Rachel frowned as she scrolled through them. This might give us leverage. Whoever this unknown is, they're clearly higher up the chain than Malcolm. Mark nodded, his mind racing. If we can track down where they're moving their operation, we can hit them hard. But we'll need to move fast. The officers worked through the night, analyzing the data from the phone and the flash drive. Rachel used cell tower records to triangulate the location of Malcolm's contact. It led them to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a known hotspot for criminal activity. Mark called in a tactical unit to prepare for a raid. "We're not waiting for them to make the next move," he said firmly. "If this warehouse is their base, we'll shut them down before they can regroup." Rachel agreed. "And while we're at it, we'll make sure Zara and her mom stay out of harm's way." As dawn broke, Mark stood outside the safe house, briefing his team. Zara and her mother watched from the window, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Mark gave them a reassuring wave before climbing into his cruiser. "This ends today," he said to Rachel as they drove toward the staging area for the raid. Rachel nodded, her determination matching his. "Let's bring them down." The final strike. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a cold industrial structure set apart from the city's bustling streets. Surrounded by chain-link fences and shadowed by overgrown trees, it was the perfect place for a criminal operation to operate under the radar. Officer Mark Thompson tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he and Rachel approached the staging area a few blocks away. The tactical unit was already assembled, their vehicles parked in a secluded lot. Officers checked their gear, their faces set with determination. The air was thick with tension as Mark and Rachel stepped out of their cruiser. Captain Herrera, the team leader, approached them with a clipboard in hand. "We've scoped out the place," Herrera began, pointing to a map spread across the hood of a patrol car. "Security cameras at all four corners, but they're outdated. 2 main entrances, one at the front and one at the loading dock in the back. Based on the intel from the phone, there's a meeting happening inside. Looks like Malcolm's associates are regrouping." Mark nodded, scanning the map. "Any movement?" Herrera tapped a marked point on the map. 3 guards on the perimeter, armed but not heavily. Inside, we're estimating 6 to 8 individuals, including their leader. If we move now, we can catch them off guard. Rachel leaned over the map. "We'll take the back entrance. If we can cut off their escape, we'll have a better chance of bringing them in alive." Herrera grunted in agreement. "Alive, if possible. But if they resist." Mark's jaw tightened. "We know what to do." The team moved into position, their vehicles dark and silent as they approached the warehouse. Mark and Rachel led one group toward the rear entrance, while Herrera's team took the front. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Mark raised a hand, signaling his team to halt. He spotted a guard pacing near the loading dock, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Mark motioned to one of the tactical officers, who moved silently through the shadows. In one swift motion, the officer subdued the guard, securing his weapon and dragging him out of sight. "Rear entrance clear," Mark whispered into his radio. "Moving in." Inside the warehouse, the air was heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. Stacks of crates and barrels created a labyrinth of shadows. Mark's team moved cautiously, their weapons drawn, their footsteps silent. Voices echoed from a room at the far end of the building. Mark held up a fist, signaling the team to stop. He listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices were sharp, filled with tension. "You think I'm going to trust you after this mess?" a man barked. "Malcolm's gone, and now the cops are breathing down our necks." Another voice, smoother but no less menacing, replied, "We have a shipment to move. I don't care what it takes. Get it done." Mark motioned for his team to spread out. He and Rachel moved closer, using the shadows for cover. Through a gap in the crates, Mark saw the source of the voices. A group of 6 men gathered around a table covered in maps and documents. Weapons were strewn carelessly across the surface. One of the men, tall and muscular, with a scar running down his cheek, seemed to be in charge. His voice was calm but commanding. "We've got eyes on the safe house. If the cops don't back off, we'll make an example of the girl and her mother." Mark's blood ran cold. He exchanged a glance with Rachel, her expression mirroring his fury. There was no time to wait. "Go," Mark whispered into his radio. The warehouse erupted into chaos as the tactical teams moved in simultaneously. Flashbangs detonated, their deafening blasts disorienting the men inside. Mark and Rachel surged forward, their weapons trained on the suspects. "Police, drop your weapons," Mark shouted. One of the men reached for a gun on the table, but Rachel was faster. A single shot from her rifle sent the weapon skidding across the floor. The suspect froze, his hands raised. The leader with the scar snarled, pulling a pistol from his waistband. He fired blindly, the shots ricocheting off the metal walls. Mark ducked behind a crate, returning fire with precision. One of the tactical officers flanked the leader, tackling him to the ground. Within minutes, the warehouse was secure. The suspects were handcuffed and lined up against the wall, their weapons confiscated. Mark stood over the leader, his chest heaving. "You're done," Mark said coldly. "Your operation is over." The man glared up at him, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "You think this ends with me? You don't know who you're dealing with." Mark leaned closer, his voice low. "You're going to tell us everything, or I'll make sure you never see the outside of a cell again." Back at the station, the interrogation began. The leader, identified as Victor Delgado, initially refused to cooperate. But under pressure, and faced with the mountain of evidence against him, he began to talk. He detailed the extent of the operation, a sprawling network of drug distribution and human trafficking, with Malcolm as one of the lower-tier operatives. Delgado admitted that the photograph and video sent to the safe house were meant to intimidate, a scare tactic to buy them time to relocate their operation. But what caught Mark's attention most was Delgado's admission that there was more at stake. "There's someone higher up," Delgado confessed. "Someone pulling the strings. You think you've won, but you've just scratched the surface." For Zara and her mother, the raid marked the beginning of a new chapter. With Delgado and his associates in custody, their immediate threat was neutralized. Mark and Rachel visited them at the safe house the next day, bringing the news. "You're safe now," Mark said, his voice gentle. "They're not going to hurt you." Zara hugged her mother tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered to Mark, "for everything." Mark crouched beside her, a small smile on his face. "You were the brave one, Zara. You trusted us when it mattered most. That's what made the difference." As Zara and her mother prepared to move to a new, secure location, Mark felt a sense of closure. But Delgado's words lingered in his mind. The fight wasn't over yet.